시청자 여러분 안녕하십니까. 굿모닝인포맥스 2부 오늘도 힘차게 문을 열어보겠습니다. 먼저 연합인포맥스 기자군단의 취재파일로 시작합니다.
네, 오늘은요. 서영태 기자가 무디스 애널리틱스의 이코노미스트에게 우리 경제에 대한 진단과 전망을 들어보는 시간을 마련했다고 하는데요. 화면으로 준비했습니다. 함께 보시죠.
So let's start with the first question then. Before the first question, would you just briefly introduce yourself to South Korean audience?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So my name is Stefan Angrik. I cover the Japanese economy and parts of Northeast Asia for Moody's Analytics. So that includes Korea in particular. It's a very large economy in Northeast Asia. I've joined Moody's Analytics about 2 years ago. Previously worked for the Asian Development Bank Institute, the Bank of Finland, Oxford Economics. So I've spent some time doing economic analysis on Asia in particular. So
Thank you. Thank you. Since you cover South Korea and Japan, I want to ask this question that South Korea's economic structure is very similar to Japan's, and two countries are competing in global export markets. What kind of advantage do South Korea have compared to Japan?
Right. So the strengths that we, Moody's Analytics, see in the Korean economy are really its strong manufacturing base and competitive exports. So Korea produces electronics, machinery, chemicals, automobiles, really high value added goods that require a lot of expertise and know-how to produce, and they're very competitive for that reason. It is true that there are similarities with Japan, but there are also differences. If you think about electronics, for example, Korea produces a lot of semiconductors, whereas Japan produces the machinery to make semiconductors. So from that point of view, you could argue the two economies also complement each other, right? And that potential for complementing one another leaves opportunity for win-win scenarios from strengthening economic ties. To that point, we might note that Korean President Yoon and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida have just been undertaking a number of efforts to improve bilateral ties, and the two countries have just restored their preferential trade status for each other. So that should make it possible to take advantage of those sorts of win-win opportunities I spoke about there.
Thank you. But South Korea is going through Japanization, and the country's birth rate is very low, and trade deficit continues this year. And what should we do to overcome this Japanization?
So it is true that Korea's birth rate is quite low. It is quite low both within the Asia-Pacific region as well as in the world in general. Economically, that means you have a smaller potential workforce. So in other words, you have fewer people who are economically active. So that makes it a little bit harder to grow in the future. One potential remedy would be to increase labor participation. So you could remove barriers to working for women, for example, or marginalized groups in general. That would raise labor participation, and that can help you offset some of the drag you're getting from demographics. Japan has actually done that over the last couple of years, and while that is a process and there's still some way to go, it's had some success with those sorts of policies. I think it's also important to remember, though, that we probably don't want to overstate the impact demographics have on economic growth. The reason the Korean economy grew as much as it did, the reason the Korean economy was able to become a high-income economy, it was so successful, is not because of demographics alone. It is because of capital accumulation. It is because of productivity gains. And those sorts of things can continue even with a population that stops growing. Indeed, we do expect the Korean economy to continue growing even with a shrinking population. So that is perfectly possible from an economic point of view, and that is what we forecast. So I think that's important to keep in mind.
So let's talk about the central bank. Yesterday, the Bank of Korea maintained its policy rate. It's 3.5%. And The Bank of Korea stopped hiking its rate, but Governor Lee said he still can hike the rate. Do you think is there any chance that Bank of Korea to start hiking rate again? If not, when would the central bank start to cut the rate?
Let me start by giving you our baseline outlook for the Bank of Korea's monetary policy. So we expect the Bank of Korea to keep interest rates at their current level through to the end of the year. So we expect the base rate to stay at the 3.5% that you mentioned, and the 3.5% where they kept it yesterday. There was some speculation in markets a while back as to whether the Bank of Korea might start cutting interest rates before the end of the year. But the governor pushed back against that very strongly. And as you noted, both the governor and the Bank of Korea's board have signaled that they would actually be open to raising interest rates further if necessary, which to our mind suggests that they're not going to cut very soon. We expect the Bank of Korea to start cutting interest rates in 2024, so next year. By that point, we also see the US Federal Reserve, so the central bank of the United States, start to cut interest rates, and inflation in Korea will have come down by that point, which will allow the Bank of Korea to focus more on economic growth rather than inflationary pressures alone. There is a risk that the Bank of Korea might raise interest rates more than we anticipate, or it might keep them elevated for longer than we anticipate. But it's hard to see that in absence of a renewed commodity price shock. Inflation in Korea was pushed higher over the last year, primarily because of higher prices for energy and food. So commodity prices, broadly speaking. Those commodity prices really surged in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but are now starting to come down. So relative to last year, energy prices are now down and food prices are down as well. The same is true in Korea. Energy prices are down and food prices a bit sticky, but they should come down in due course as well. Another factor that has pushed up inflation in Korea is housing, but housing prices are coming down as well. We're seeing that, and to the extent that raw material prices factor into housing, they're also coming down because, again, global commodity prices are coming down. Inflation might prove a little bit stickier than we expect because prices for leisure and travel-related services, they are up quite a bit. That is something we're seeing in a number of countries across the world as COVID-19 pandemic restrictions are rolled back. There's a desire on part of many people to go back to travel, to eat out at restaurants, and that sort of demand is stronger than the supply. So supply can't quite keep up, which means that prices in those services, they're going up and they might stay up for a bit longer. But most of that is factored into our own baseline. And as mentioned, unless we see a renewed surge in global commodity prices, we don't expect inflation to surge again, which will mean that the Bank of Korea is also unlikely to hike interest rates further, at least in our baseline view.
But still, there will be other risks to South Korea's economy. What are the biggest risks that can put pressure on South Korea's growth rate in the near future?
So Moody's Analytics, we see three key risks facing the Korean economy. Number one would be a global recession. Recession risks are quite elevated across the world, and there's particular concern around the US economy at the moment. And many of the traditional recession leading indicators of recession, they are flashing red. So if the US economy or the global economy more broadly were to slow, that would certainly affect Korea negatively through exports, through production, as well as a host of other channels. If we think about the US economy, there's a couple of different things that could bring about a recession. One would be a deterioration in financial market conditions. We've seen earlier this year how the US had a number of banking failures. And while those have been contained for now, and we don't expect more bank failures, financing conditions, financial conditions in the US have already tightened quite a bit. Banks are making it harder to get a loan, and that is going to slow growth, and that is going to slow investment, particularly at small and mid-sized businesses. Similarly, you can think of a monetary policy misstep. If central banks were to misjudge where the economy is going, that might derail economic growth and precipitate a recession. Or finally, the current talks around the US debt limit, there's still not a lot of clarity how those are going to get resolved. They seem to be taking one step forward one day and then one step backward the next. That could also damage the economy. So any one of those factors or a combination of those could set off a global recession, and that would then damage the Korean economy. That's the biggest and the first risk. The second is inflation. As mentioned, inflation in Korea is still fairly elevated. It is just below 4%. That is lower than where it was last year. It exceeded 6% in July of 2022. But it is still too high for comfort, and it is still weighing on household budgets. There's a lot of talk around cost of living pressures in Korea. So inflation needs to come down more. And as we spoke earlier, if inflation were to surge again for whatever reason, that would amplify these concerns and would also damage business spending, household spending, and thereby economic growth. So that is another big risk factor we are paying attention to. Finally, household debt. So we spoke about this just now. Our concern here is that it would slow consumption spending simply because debt service is going up as interest rates are going up. So even if we don't see any acute, immediate risk for the broader economy, it will definitely weigh on growth. And it makes sense to pay attention to that aspect in terms of policy going forward over the medium and long term. So those are the three risk factors we're seeing.
Thank you. This is my last question. What is Moody's Analytics estimate on South Korea's growth rate this year? And what should we expect for the second half of this year?
So we expect the Korean economy to grow 1.4% in 2023. That is a little bit slower than last year. I believe last year the Korean economy grew 2.6% or something thereabouts. There's two reasons why we expect the economy to slow this year. Number one is the subdued global outlook. As we spoke about earlier, the global economy is fairly weak at the moment. It's flirting with recession. And for that reason, external demand for Korean exports is quite weak. Exports supported Korean economic growth throughout the last 2 years, but the reverse is happening now. Export demand is down, which means export growth is down as well. The electronic cycle is also in a down cycle at the moment. So again, we spoke about this earlier. Korea is very strong at producing semiconductors, consumer electronics and the like, and that whole sector right now is very weak, and demand for electronics is very weak, and that is another factor that is weighing on Korean shipments. Finally, the Chinese economy, demand from China is very weak at the moment. China reopened. It stopped zero COVID policies recently, which supported growth in the first quarter of this year. But most of that was on the services side, and demand for imports in China is still not quite coming back to the extent that we would like. And again, that is another factor that is weighing on Korean exports. So overall, external demand is going to be quite weak this year. Domestic demand is also softer. Domestic demand got a big boost last year from the rollback of COVID-19 restrictions, and much of that is fading at the moment. It is still going to continue to grow, though. So there's still a modicum of growth from domestic demand because inflation is coming down. We've also seen this show up in consumer sentiment recently. It's improved a little bit. So there's still some growth here, but it is also softer than last year. So both of these factors, we expect those to carry into the second half of this year. External demand is probably going to remain pretty weak. Domestic demand will see a modicum of growth, but also it's going to be slower than what we had last year. Things are only really going to change next year, we believe. Next year, the global economy should find better footing, which will help external demand recover. And domestic demand should also improve on the back of inflation coming down. Inflation should hit around 2% by the end of this year, early next year. So that will help businesses and households. And the Bank of Korea will then also start cutting interest rates, as mentioned earlier, which will help business spending, and it will help take pressure off household budgets. So again, that should help domestic demand eke out better growth next year. Our forecast for next year is 2.4%, so much better than what we had this year. Let me leave it there.
네, 서영태 기자가 준비해온 인터뷰 내용 함께 보셨는데요. 좀 어떠셨어요?
저는 3가지 메모를 했습니다. 한국도 일본처럼 빠르게 인구 감소가 나타나겠지만은 그럼에도 불구하고 성장세는 이어갈 것이다. 이런 얘기가 희망적으로 들렸고요.
네.
또 올해는 1.4% 성장에 그치겠지만 내년에는 2.4%.
네.
올해 말까지는 금리 수준을 좀 유지되겠지만 내년에는 금리가 인하될 것이다. 이 세 가지가 저는 눈에 띄었는데요. 어쨌건 이 전체적으로 봤을 때 무디스의 전망은 굉장히 저는 합리적이라고 생각하는데 어쨌건 희망적인 메시지를 봤다고 생각합니다.
맞습니다.